They mocked him before he even opened his mouth. To them, he was nothing more than the African help, someone to serve, not someone to be respected. The millionaire's manager smirked, testing him with foreign words, certain he'd stumble and embarrass himself. But what came next silenced the entire room. One flawless sentence, spoken in the crispest British accent, shattered every assumption they held. Who really held the power in that moment? The man with wealth, or the man they tried to belittle? He had worked in the mansion for months, moving quietly through polished hallways and marble staircases that never seemed to notice him. To the millionaire's family, he was just another pair of hands, ironing shirts, carrying trays, cleaning silver that sparkled brighter than the smiles they gave him. His name was rarely spoken. He was simply the boy, the help, or worse, the African. But behind the silence of his work lived a story no one cared to ask about. Back home, he had been a student of languages, fascinated by how words could cross borders faster than any ship or plane. He spent nights bent over battered textbooks, learning English sentence by sentence until the rhythm became his own. While his friends rested, he read aloud, perfecting every sound, molding his voice into something sharp and precise. Yet when he arrived in this wealthy home, his knowledge remained hidden. The family never asked, and he never offered. Here, his identity was pressed into the fabric of servitude, his dreams folded away with the linens he ironed. But he carried them silently, tucked inside like a flame waiting for air. That flame would be tested on a night when the house filled with powerful men, laughter, and a manager who believed mocking him was part of the evening's entertainment. The guests arrived in gleaming cars, the mansion glittering with chandeliers and arrogance. The servant moved through the room, tray in hand, his presence barely acknowledged except by the eyes that judged. Then the manager appeared, and a man whose suit was polished, but whose pride shone brighter. He looked at the servant as though his very existence threatened the luxury of the evening. With calculated cruelty, he spoke to the room. "Do you think he understands a word of this?" Laughter rippled, bouncing off the walls like applause for his cruelty. The servant lowered his eyes, but the heat in his chest grew. The manager wasn't done. He began tossing out phrases in Mandarin, speaking quickly, loudly, as though performing a show. The guests leaned back, entertained, their smiles stretching wider each time the servant remained silent. One whispered, "See? He hasn't got a clue." Another raised a glass, mocking applause. To them, his silence was proof of stupidity, not discipline. The servant's hands tightened on the tray. He remembered long nights of practice, the sound of British broadcasters echoing through a battered radio, the effort it had taken to mimic each syllable until his tongue obeyed. They had no idea who they were laughing at. The manager shifted again, now switching to French, then Italian, mixing fragments of languages, like weapons, thrown carelessly at a man they believed defenseless. The room roared with laughter. Some clapped, others pointed openly, as though his humiliation were a game to be shared. Inside, a storm rose. His father's words echoed, "Let them measure you by your silence, but when the time comes, let your voice be the weight that crushes their pride." The servant's silence was not ignorance, it was patience, and that patience had reached its limit. He placed the tray carefully on a table, the glassware rattling just enough to hush the laughter. The shift in the air was almost invisible, but it unsettled the room. For the first time, eyes watched him not as furniture, but as a man who was about to do something unexpected. The laughter faltered, and in that silence, he opened his mouth. The first words that poured out were not broken fragments, not clumsy echoes. They were crisp, measured, and delivered in the kind of flawless British accent that many of the men in the room had never managed themselves. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who had mastered his craft in silence, each syllable a strike against the arrogance that had filled the evening. In seconds, the laughter turned to stunned silence. Glasses paused halfway to lips, eyes widened, and the smug expression on the manager's face drained into disbelief. The room had expected stumbles, embarrassment, perhaps even an awkward attempt that would feed their mockery further. What they received instead was perfection. His voice carried across the hall like a mirror, reflecting their cruelty back at them. The manager shifted uncomfortably, searching for words, but finding none. The guests, moments ago entertained, now stared with shame flickering behind their surprise. And in that moment, the servant was no longer invisible. He was undeniable. What had been meant as humiliation became revelation, not of his weakness, but of their prejudice. And the silence that filled the mansion was heavier than the laughter that came before. When the evening ended, the guests left quieter than they had arrived. The arrogance that had filled the mansion seemed thinner, weaker, like smoke dissipating after a fire. The manager, once the loudest voice in the room, kept his eyes low, his pride pierced by a truth he could never erase. The man he mocked had stood taller, without lifting a finger. The servant returned to his work, but nothing was the same. They now looked at him differently, not with the respect he deserved, perhaps, but with the uneasy realization that their judgments had been wrong. For him, it wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about reclaiming dignity that had been denied. That night, the servant reminded them, and the world beyond the mansion walls, that worth is not written on skin, nor dictated by wealth. It lives in resilience, in the quiet fire of those who rise above ridicule and expose prejudice. For what it truly is, weakness, disguised as power. He remained a servant in title, but not in spirit. The room had learned that true authority can rest in the most unexpected places. Even in the hands of the man they tried to silence. And as you listen to this story, ask yourself, how many voices have been ignored, mocked, or silenced simply because of prejudice? How many more will it take before we finally listen? Not to the language spoken, but to the humanity it carries? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, emotional stories that challenge the way we see the world.